thanks for tuning in again to Alter Egos. I'm your host, Glenn, and with me this week, as always, is Joey. Joey, how's it going this week?
All right. How about yourself?
Good. Yeah, it's been a slightly colder weekend, but it's nice to be able to be recording and talking all things about the Zola scenario from the Red Skull campaign box. Obviously, it's the fourth scenario in the box, and it kind of is one that I feel raises the stakes a little bit from the previous three and introduces some really interesting mechanics and challenges that we haven't seen in a scenario before. And really, that's generally a good sign of an engaging piece of gameplay that we haven't otherwise had. So, yeah, what are your, general impressions and initial response to playing through the Zola scenario?
I generally feel like the Zola scenario is a continuation of the series of scenarios that we have that we already know kind of work. These like minion heavy scenarios where the villain isn't actually the main threat, but you're like being swamped by minions, which is ramping him up. Similar to I feel it's fairly similar to Mutagen and Ultron a bit, where they make a somewhat like an alternate win condition using these minions. But it's still a very good example of that like archetype of scenario, I would say. It's and it also has a little bit of an element of discarding from itself. It's actually a little bit stronger than I would say Claw's version of that, which can make for some interesting gameplay once you start adding in modular sets.
Yeah, so he's a villain that he seems to, he has a base of 2 scheme, starts off with 1 attack and kind of builds up to the 2 attack. He's the first villain to always have Retaliate 1, which I thought was an interesting wrinkle. But like you said, the main focus of his scenario and mechanics is really all about sort of the minion heavy interactions. And in particular, his main scheme has a force response that kind of ensures that there's a consistent production of minions coming out for the players to engage with. And then on top of that, there's a ton of attachments in the scenario set that really kind of complement quite well the minions that we have in the set, but also the potential modular sets, as you mentioned there. Something, for instance, that I noticed is that the 10 minions that are in this, scenario or set, like the villain set. So the 4 Ultimate Bioservants, the 3 Zolas Mutate, and the 3 Berserk Mutates all actually have the Hydra trait. So if you run either Hydra Assault, which has Hail Hydra in it as a treachery, or if you run Legions of Hydra, there's a pretty good chance at the higher player count that those cards are going to have a pretty significant impact on your experience in the game. And I quite like that there's, again, sort of that cross synergy with particular modular sets, but also any modular set that does have a minion really kind of has the higher risk of it coming out more consistently. So things like Ronin, MODOK, which already have ways to come into play faster, or on the other end, modular sets that have the tech keyword, and so then they're able to complement the sub theme of the Zola's mutates that can go fetch them, though that's not as prevalent as the first sort of basket of modular sets. But overall, I really like that this is a 2 main scheme scenario with I guess Zola himself is a bit less interesting than what you might hope. But I think there's a lot going on between the main scheme trigger, the minions, and the lighthouse, the prison, that the lighthouse that's become the prison. I think there's a lot going on there. But yeah, I'm with you. I think this is a good continuation of a type of scenario that we've seen work well in the past. And I think it delivers on it and does it even better than the previous ones, in my personal opinion. What are your thoughts on just the initial setup of the scenario? So, like, you have, I believe, on Expert, a test
subjects, Hydra prisons, and a ultimate bioservant for each player.
Yeah. So, what are your thoughts on that sort of initial puzzle that you have to solve as a solo player.
Yeah, well, to start with, you don't have to solve the prison at all. In some characters, it's actually beneficial to not solve it. For instance, Iron Man.
Just leave him to die, or
just
you can
leave Rhodey in the prison. No one cares about War Machine. He can just stay there.
I haven't looked, but what's the ruling? Like, can you add the other War Machine to your deck if you do lose
you
that
can,
one?
because you're no longer considered to have War Machine in your deck. You have to add a card. And you can choose the other War Machine. It's great. In a campaign mode, you want to clear the Hydra Prison by the end of the game, just so that you can get the upgraded condition card. But in a non-campaign mode, when you're playing Zola, you can actually just leave War Machine there the entire game. It's great, and it makes you immune to Master Plan, because it just puts more threat on the Hydra Prison. So yeah, that's not really a thing. But the test subjects, particularly, you have to clear the test subjects turn 1, which is not difficult because it's only 2 threat per player. Like, if you can't remove 2 threat per player on a deck, on any build that is well, I suppose in solo play you have to remove it turn 1. In multiplayer, it doesn't matter as much because it's not as big an impact having an additional card. But in solo, you need to be able to remove that 2 threat, and if you can't remove 2 threat, that means that if you were playing, say, Rhino, you wouldn't have been able to move the 3 threat. And there's just so many. There's so many of those at this point, where you've got like a hazard symbol with 3 threat on it. I think you need to be, at any solo deck you're building probably needs to be able to do that, and this is no exception. And like half the characters we have can just thwart it, and it's gone. I think it's actually over half, but the so that part of the setup that has to go. But then you get the extra minion, and now you have 2 minions you have to deal with, and it's better, I would say, to deal with 2 minions than it is to deal with an extra encounter card. But the 2 minions could be a lot, and you need to find some way to deal with them, particularly if you get an unfortunate pull. Like, if you've got like a 9 HP character and you pull a mutate, you're going to get hit probably twice by that mutate, maybe even 3 times, and that's a lot of damage.
Yeah, the Zola's mutate's actually probably the worst pull because of the when revealed effect triggers as well. Interestingly, if the force response on the island of Dr. Zola triggers, you don't actually put.
Yeah, you put it into play, not reveal
Zola's
it.
mutate,
So so you don't trigger the when revealed. It's the same as the Defender of the 9 Realms from Thor, where you can avoid the when revealed, but you still get quick strikes because that's an enters play ability. I think it's actually an engages player ability rather than a when revealed.
Yeah, so I think it's like an interesting wrinkle, and so that's the risk of test subjects. And like I said, I really like what these minions do, so it is interesting when you have a villain set that kind of synergizes quite well between the different effects. And ultimately, discarding cards on the top of the encounter deck helps get the villain further towards an additional acceleration token, which can benefit the villain in the long run. It's interesting that I think I agree with you that like having a plan for being able to remove 2 threat is generally a good idea for a solo deck. Even 3 threat in some cases for some of the different side schemes that exist in the game that start in play with 3 threat per player. I guess what's interesting is once you get up to 2, 3, or 4 player counts, this test subjects becomes a little bit trickier to remove unless everyone commits to it early. And at that stage, you also have all 4 ultimate bioservants in play. And so not only do they have toughness as a 1 scheme, 1 attack, 4 health minion, but they also then, if you as players draw attachments in the first encounter phase, then you're going to potentially make them a bit more deadly as the game goes on. And they are tricky. Like I think a 4 health minion with toughness is a bit trickier than, say, the Zola's mutate with 5 health base. I'm not sure what your thoughts are on that, but for me, someone that's able to relentless assault the mutate is going to do better than trying to find a way to clear the toughness and then play relentless assault, for instance, on the bioservants.
Yeah, the 4 with toughness is worst case, effectively 5. So that is a lot more dangerous. And I have found that typically when I'm pulling mutates, it's probably from the main scheme ability. That's the most consistent way to pull minions from this deck, I feel. Which means that often their when revealed doesn't go off, and in which case they've only got +1 attack on the bioservant, and like the equivalent of the bioservant's worst case HP. Whereas functionally, I feel like a toughness is normally worth 2 or maybe even 3 a lot of the time, because it's really hard to get that 1 damage hit.
Yeah, some players and some heroes just don't have the ability to deal just 1 damage. So sometimes toughness becomes this awkward thing of you're trading 2 or 3 damage, and you just kind of have to make that trade. I think sometimes, particularly in solo play.
Yeah, Hulk can't do less than like 3 damage, outside of his aspect cards. It can get really silly sometimes in cases like that. Although your stat line can also determine that. Like Miss Marvel can ping off the toughness by going up and punching it herself, which is unusual, but it's an option that works.
Yeah, that's an interesting point about that. I think in the long run, we'll kind of see that piercing might be a little bit more of an engaging mechanic for particular players, and also I guess also range, because range becomes relevant for the retaliate trigger here. I've played a lot of Hawkeye into the campaign, and every time I hit this scenario, I'm very thankful that I have Hawkeye. And so most of my arrow shots go towards Zola, and then vibranium arrows often go towards the bioservant. And I found that there's some really strong synergy, like just in terms of the ease at which you can kind of have answers in Hawkeye's kit. Whereas some of the other heroes, I find that if you're generating toughness on yourself with Doctor Strange, then the retaliate one's a bit awkward. Trying to clear toughness on the bioservants is a bit awkward, but then you can also play the vapors to switch the toughness, I guess. But yeah, I think there's a lot of different subtle things being done in this scenario that really add, I guess, a few curveballs to the scenario, and it means that players have to come up with new answers. And I really enjoy that it's very fresh and refreshing and engaging. And I think it's just what I wanted from a scenario, and this one delivered.
Have you ever had the bioservant actually stack up? I managed to get one up to like 4 attack at one point. They had one of each of the upgrades. It was kind of scary.
I've never had 4. I think I've had 2. I've had 2 attachments be placed on it. I found it really interesting. When the scenario goes on, I guess to rephrase, when a villain in Canada deck actually starts executing what it's intended to do, like rather consistently, I really enjoy it, because it feels like both the deck and the players are, firing on all cylinders. Like sometimes when you get the start of, like, let's say double resource, Avengers Mansion, and like Golden City as Black Panther, right? Like you feel like in a very winning position from the get-go, because you just get all your ramp out turn 1 with relative ease, and you can play down one of your upgrades. Whereas like that's what it feels like for Zola, where he gets 1 or 2 additional attachments on the bioservant, you can't clear it, and then all of a sudden you're looking at a very scary minion that then also you draw one of those berserkers as your card for the turn. So then there's the quick strike, and suddenly there's this a multitude of threats on the board. And in particular, like you said, like test subject is just that really nice additional twist on the challenge, where you have to pick between a chance at drawing a bad card each turn, or you can, for once off, exhaust your hero, thwart for 2, and then get a new minion in play and just cop the early beating. It's a nice way to front load the challenge in an interesting way. And I think it's more interesting than, say, just dealing the player an additional random encounter card. I find sometimes, while that does increase the challenge, it's not as engaging as this way of approaching the front load. Yeah, that's a lot of that's a lot about the Ultimate Bioservant. Did you have any interesting interactions between the attachments and the minions that you wanted to talk about, or any modular sets that kind of complemented what's happening with Zola?
There's a decent number of modular sets that complemented. I didn't have any particularly interesting interactions with these upgrades besides having one of each of them on a bioservant at one point. But there's a lot of we have a decent number of modular sets that are focused on minions at this point, like Legions of Hydra, Hydra Assault, Hydra Patrol, Masters of Evil, all have a large number of the one from Kang, Anachronauts. I can't remember how to pronounce it, but they've all got like decent numbers of minions. Masters of Evils and the Kang one both have some like mini bossy enemies, and like those mini bossy enemies have a tendency to stick around for a turn a lot of the time. Like you don't want them to, but you try your best. But you can't always deal 7 damage to remove Radioactive Man every turn, and then that gives them more of a chance of being upgraded with these tech cards, and that just makes them slightly scarier. Like I don't really want to be hit for free and then lose a card from my hand because my Radioactive Man managed to get neurological implants on him. But the other thing that I find fairly interesting is the MODOK set. I don't actually really like the MODOK set. I actually think the Legions of Hydra is a higher difficulty on it, and the MODOK set is generally just not. It's generally better to just ignore it. But you can't ignore MODOK if he's got 10 hit points in guard and retaliate 2, or 12 hit points and retaliate 3. You can't ignore him at that point. And he's very likely to get any of the Zola upgrades because they all go to the highest minion, highest remaining hit points, and you typically don't hit MODOK until you can kill him.
Yeah, the neurological implants on a MODOK is kind of terrifying, and then the pain inhibitors giving him retaliate 3 seems.
I think the guard is
painful.
The worst. Like,
oh yeah,
10
that
hit
would
points
that
guard
would
retaliate
really be disruptive. Yeah, especially if he has the upgrade from his set that prevents him from like when he would
from
die.
dying.
Yeah, like that's a really painful combination. I think somewhere, I think I saw on Facebook that Caleb said initially it was tested with Doomsday Chair, but then they needed to scale back the difficulty a little bit, and so that's why they've ended up with Under Attack, which still has some synergy, but obviously the MODOK set really hammers home a lot of the interactions that they're hoping for with this encounter. And I think, like you said, sorry?
There are very few scenarios that I actually like the MODOK set in, and this is probably the best of them.
Yeah, I think it's a really strong set, and it's nice when, I guess, a modular set gets to see the light of day a little bit more. Like you said, it's a personal preference thing, but this scenario definitely has a that complementation from the MODOK set. I guess the other thing to note is how like a lot of these minions have boost abilities that are rather interesting, like the mutates, boost Zola's attack value by potentially a quite high degree, between +2 and +3, depending on when you draw the mutate. And similarly, the Berserk. I meant the Berserk mutate.
Yeah, I managed to get I think it was a +4 or something at one point, because I'd had a bunch of I had just happened to get a shuffle at the same time that I had a test subjects in play, so I was drawing like 3 or 4 cards in a turn or something, and I ended up drawing a couple of the things that add more test counters, Um,
Technological enhancements. It has Insight 1, and when revealed, place 1 test counter on the main scheme. Yeah.
yeah, so I ended up over the three, over the normal three limit, and Zola ended up attacking and just swinging for a ton. Thankfully I was chump blocking at the time, so basically nothing. It didn't matter at all. But um, he actually got a decent swing in because of the number of test counters I had going on.
Yeah, because the force response doesn't clear them until after step 1 concludes. So throughout the player phase, and then um, the entirety of the villain phase after he's triggered the 3, that's the
Well, also, if
opportunity
you
for
get
Wreck and
more than
Scale.
three, you can potentially get to like say 6 or 7, and then it's only going to remove three. It's not going to trigger twice in one turn.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, it's actually a really interesting interaction as you scale it up the player count, because that often can happen a bit more frequently between the 2 boost effects on technological enhancements and the boost effects on the Berserk Mutate. I found it interesting that overall, though, his pip density is a bit low. A lot of the attachments have only 1 pip, and then the 10 minions all just have a boost ability with no actual pip number.
I think that's fine in this scenario because it's he a similar idea in mutagen formula that also has a very low pip density. It's actually the lowest out of all the scenarios we had prior to Rise of Red Skull coming out. I haven't double checked since. But the threat is from him ramping up by putting in more minions, not from him actually dealing damage to you. This is actually a really good scenario if you've got unflappable um, to play into, because he's never going to hit for he's never like if you've got like unflappable on a Spider-Man, you can block him like every turn for an extra card. It like almost guaranteed with like next to no setup.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing overall. Really, can be good to be able to test those sort of decks and have consistent results and see how things operate. And so yeah, Zola's probably a good target for that. We didn't really talk about it, but there is also the treachery of Zola Mind Ray, which is where Zola, sort of like Zola's activation treachery. A lot of villains seem to have these. But interestingly, he can either confuse or stun you depending on what form you're in. What are your thoughts on this sort of activator for this scenario? Like, do you find
This one's kind of rough. It's just kind of rough in general. Uh, this is a fairly scary effect. Normally, I would rate an activation as one of the worst effects that we can generally get, and then adding a stun on top of that, stun or confuse on top of that, just makes it kind of awful. You're probably losing another 1 to 2 resources of value on top of that, on top of the attack itself, and like that's putting it up there with some of the scariest cards, I feel, just in the game in general. So thankfully there's only a couple of these. Not 3 of these, sorry, in the deck. Because out of all the cards that he has, that's probably actually the scariest one to flip.
yeah, it can really hamper your turn to find good answers for, say, a buffed up minion or a necessary removal of threat on the main scheme. I
Yeah, well,
particularly
if you're in Alter Ego, he's just schemed twice, and you're now confused.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, it's quite brutal in that sense. And if, say, you've left test subjects in play, like you could potentially have Mind Ray in advance, and be on your way to reshuffling all the cards and starting again. But yeah, I think I found that overall, it's interesting how Zola kind of does have that potential to kind of surprise you in those ways. I think the confuse and stun are quite disruptive to an individual player's game plan. And in higher player counts, the balance there is that you're obviously drawing more cards, so there's more chance of the attachments coming down on the minions as well. I guess I wanted to just quickly cover also the Zola's Experiment side scheme, which has a force response after a minion enters play. Attach the topmost tech attachment in the encounter discard pile to that minion. And I wanted to also then touch on the Zola Stage 3. But let's just start with the Experiment card. How often has this come out for you, and is it easy to clear for you in single player, or what's been your thoughts on this?
Well, it's a free threat card in solo, and if my deck is built to clear free threat on turn 1, consistently, that generally means that any hand that I have should have an answer to clear free threat, or most hands at the very least. And the worst case I've ever had with this was it came out and I had to use Defender of the Nine Realms to clear it. So at least only one minion got a tech card from the bin. But I don't really want to be putting the tech attachments on these minions if I can avoid it. Particularly ones I've dealt with. Like, that means that whatever tech upgrade had gone on something was scary enough to want me to justify me removing it. And in this case, I'm also this minion has full hit points. It's not like I've softened them up and then they've got a tech upgrade and then I just kill them off. This is actually this minion will always be full hit points. And it doesn't come up consistently. You don't in solo. You don't often go through the full deck, and even when you do, like, half the cards go as boost cards and half the cards go as actual effects. But this one, you need to remove it as soon as it comes out. There's too many ways for him to get minions into play.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I found in 4-player, something that has 12 threat when it enters play often means it's going to be around for at least one turn, which is dangerous. For instance, when we were playing with Late Night Gaming, we drew the Anachronauts side scheme. I can't remember what it's called, but essentially it's a hazard icon. And, hazard icon's not the worst, but we did want to try and clear it to avoid the acceleration token from moving from one stage of Kang to the next. The wrinkle is that the Justice player had Spider-Man, the ally, the 5-cost ally, but someone was actually playing Spider-Man. So we couldn't use it to nuke the side scheme. And so in 4-player, finding ways to answer 12 threat can often be a bit more challenging than, say, in 2-player trying to find 6 threat. And so that was just an interesting wrinkle that we found. And so similar with this one, I feel like at minimum, it often takes 2 turns to clear at higher player counts. In solo, it's a bit easier to include cards in your deck that do thwart for 3, depending on what aspect you're playing. But yeah, I think I'm with you that getting attachments is a bit of a risk. And I think it adds a lot to the encounter deck overall that this exists as a side scheme. It's a really interesting card. So that leaves us with the Zola Stage 3. And the only thing I wanted to comment on was just overall, I guess, I felt like Zola's HP is a bit lower than what I'd expect compared to how it had scaled the previous 3 scenarios. But also that his when revealed kind of does scale with player count. And I thought that was a really nice addition to the scenario overall, where you transition to Stage 3, and often that's when you're able to rapidly defeat a villain. And in some cases, this particular scenario might throw at you particular minions that get in the way of that. I can't think of many minions, but like, let's say you're running the Legions of Hydra, you might hit a soldier that has guard, and then you're in trouble.
You're searching, you get to choose what minion you want to grab.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, there is a world where like most of them are in play, but often not. So I guess you do have the choice a little bit more. But overall, I just quite enjoyed the additional concept there. It is a bit of a shame that you have to pick because it means it's a bit easier, but you do have to reveal it. So if you do go for the mutate, you're in trouble. But I guess you'd probably prioritize the Berserk or the Bioservant depending on if you can defeat Zola stage 3 that turn. What's been your strategy for this stage 3?
I normally take the. I think I normally take the mutate unless there's unless I'm playing a modular set that has an easier minion in it. I've definitely taken. I'm trying to think of the name of it. It's the one that has like Insight 1 on it. From Hydra Patrol. I'm pretty sure I was playing Hydra Patrol in that one. And I just grabbed that because I'll put one Prod over there and kill a 2 HP minion. It's nothing. But 16 hit points in a solo in solo is also nothing. That's there are a lot of ways you can do that in like 2-3 attacks. There's very few characters that can't do 16 damage in a single turn. The only one I can really think of, even if we're just considering the hero set, is it's really hard to do more than 13 damage as Hulk. But most other characters should be able to easily handle 16 damage in a single turn, and I don't focus on it as much as I do in, say, mutagen formula. But you can easily just have that sometimes, and just not have to deal with the minion at all.
Yeah. I think that's what I've found is that sometimes when you hit stage 3, you've kind of stabilized and you're ready to kind of just close out the game. And so I'm not sure how much one minion per player disrupts the ability to close the game out the following turn. I think it's just a matter of when you happen to trigger this ability and what else is in play that might influence how many additional turns it's going to take to win. The low health pool to me is kind of like why you're able to close it out a bit faster. For instance, 16 per player is relatively low, but because of the retaliate, I guess it's problematic. For instance, if say it had 25 health per player, similar to Kang, like that might just be a bit too much for everyone to handle.
The fact that because of the retaliate and the fact that always has retaliate, you've basically turned off all ally damage the entire game, because you're almost never going to attack with an ally when he's got a retaliate 1 on him. That damage adds up very quickly, so it's like these games can go fairly long just because you're not getting that extra little bit of damage that you would normally throw at him, and it has to go somewhere. It has to do something else instead.
Yeah, I think, and like I said earlier with Hawkeye, it's interesting that range is relatively hard to come by at the moment, but it'd be interesting to see if that becomes a bit more relevant as the card pool expands and whether or not we're getting more during this cycle of Avengers to help us answer Retaliate a bit more. I guess the other caveat with Retaliate is that cards that are not attacks don't trigger Retaliate. So things like Thunderclap. Yeah, what was that one? Sorry.
The Crimson Bands of Sadarak.
Right. Yes, that's 7
damage and stuff.
That's probably the best example. Doctor Strange is he's a distant memory for me. But yeah, so certainly anything that's not an attack but that deals damage is
Nick
quite
Fury
helpful.
overkill. Yeah, Nick Fury overkill. Any of the AoE skills except for the shield toss, because that's not really an AoE skill. I suppose melee is also an attack, and kind of AoE. But your ground stomps, your squirrel girls, your energy daggers are all not attacks.
Yes. Yeah.
Yarnborn is not an attack.
Yeah, the Nick Fury one is very common. I would say I'd argue it's probably a bit more common, and I've definitely enjoyed that. I've used him for the 4 damage in this scenario quite a bit, so that's a really good point.
I have a tendency to, if I'm having issues with something like a guard minion or something else, or if I'm expecting a lot of guard or retaliate, I try and drop it down to about 4 if I know I'm running Nick Fury. I've definitely done that with mutagen before, where I couldn't kill them, but I could drop him down to exactly 4 hit points. So I just need to hold on to a Nick Fury and I'll win next turn no matter what.
Yeah, he certainly is the Gandalf of this game. There's no doubt about that. I guess as we come to a close here, the one thing I did want to comment is or question I wanted to leave you with, Joey, and as well as the listeners, is which Nemesis minion do you think is the scariest with all these attachments that are in this scenario? Like which minion would you not want to face down with a defensive programming, pain inhibitors, and neurological implants attached?
I think I'll go with the Viper. I wouldn't want to have a -1 hand size alongside all that.
Yeah, I think it's a really strong one to recommend. That's a great point there. You're gonna be in a lot of trouble if you're trying to clear her with even more limited resources. Yeah, I don't think I can top that. I think it's a fantastic one. I was gonna say Thomas Edison I think it is from Miss Marvel, because you can't clear him unless the other minions
unless you killed every other minion.
Yeah, so like if either him or like the minion that you also have happens to have attachments, it can get a bit dicey because he's essentially just going to be hitting you or thwarting for a certain amount each turn.
Yeah, and his scheme value is very already. So if he's got neurological implants, he's a 5 scheme.
Yeah. So yeah, I thought that was an interesting way to close off. Unless you have any final thoughts, it's been a pleasure to talk about Zola.
Nope, that's it for me.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for listening, and we'll be back next week for our final thoughts on the scenarios of the campaign box for the Rise of Red Skull, featuring the Red Skull himself. Thanks for listening, everyone.